Without further ado, really, I'll hand over to my esteemed colleague, Leo Stemp, who will take us through UK opportunities investment outlook. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. And yeah, welcome back. Good to see you all this morning, bright and breezy, bright and early here. We've got a great panel to start things off this morning on UK opportunities. We talked yesterday about the US shale revolution and where that could be potentially redone. And the UK, we kind of left that out of the discussion yesterday because the UK is obviously a prime example of an opportunity to exploit some shale opportunities. So today, to talk about that opportunity, we're delighted to welcome from Untitled Capital, based here in Hong Kong, but focused very much on the UK, the Managing Director and Head of Investments and Portfolio Management, Julian Ball. So Julian, please. We have Francis Egan, who is the CEO of Cuadrilla, which is obviously, as everyone knows, the company that is really blazing a trail for the unconventional industry in the UK. So Francis, delighted to welcome you today. And also from Hanam & Partners, based out of London, delighted to welcome Director at Hanam, Samuel Merlin. So, gentlemen, please, we have a round of applause for our panelists. A little bit of Danish pastry went the wrong way there, but anyway, let's start things off by talking about, what is the size of the prize? The UK. Tell us a little bit about the prospectivity. Should we start off of the UK? I mean, what is the potential? Francis, do you want to kick us off with that?
Yeah, the size of the resource in the UK is enormous. The British Geological Survey, who are a UK in effect state entity, were asked by the government to make an assessment of this in 2013, or a little later than that actually. They have access to all the well data in the UK, and they studied this for about 18 months, and they came up with a in-place gas estimate across the north of England of roughly 1,300 trillion cubic feet of gas in place. Total UK annual gas demand is 3 trillion cubic feet. So, a huge volume of gas in place, but of course the big unanswered question is how much of that gas in the ground can be commercially extracted, and that's what Cuadrilla is very close to answering here in the next few months in the UK.
So you're talking about is it the Boland Shale you're talking about?
Yeah, it's commonly referred to as the Boland Shale. Geologists like to divide it into at least 3 separate basins across the north of England. It's a huge expanse of rock. It starts at about 1.5 kilometres below the surface, extends from Liverpool on the west coast all the way across to the east coast in Yorkshire, overlaying former coal mining and existing oil and gas producing areas. In fact, it extends all the way down under the North Sea and into continental Europe. It's a prolific source rock, and that's evidenced by the fact of multiple onshore and offshore oil and gas producing fields in the area.
And under the South Downs as well,
So under the South Downs, there is a separate source rock called the Kimmeridge Clay, and again, that has been a prolific source rock offshore in the North Sea. It is estimated to contain potentially billions of oil. It's an oil play, not a gas play. It's a shallower play and a fractured limestone play within the Kimmeridge Clay itself. Cuadrilla certainly has less activity, although we have drilled the only horizontal well in that play.
Fantastic. And what is the investor appetite in the UK at the moment for companies who are looking at the UK?
Maybe if I start off and then pass over to Sam. I think a lot of people have been playing really a sort of a wait and see game as to what's been happening. There was I guess as we went through the period, there was a lot of concerns with respect to the regulatory environment in the UK as to whether things would ever happen. So Kerogen is an investor actually in Cuadrilla. Kerogen is also an investor in iGas, the other large listed company in the UK. back in 2013, Centrica came in as a partner. Centrica, the large UK oil and gas distributor, that came in actually as a partner into the Boland Shale. At that time, there were quite a number of other companies who were looking as to what could possibly happen in this area, but there was a lot of concern about the above-ground risk and whether this would ever actually happen. I think as we've gone through that process over the last 4 or 5 years, which has taken a very long period of time, I think we're sort of coming out to that back end of that. And with some of the other geopolitical things that are happening, both with Brexit and with some of the other pressures that we've been seeing with respect to infrastructure, with respect to issues around Russia, etc., there's been sort of a confluence of actual items which are pushing things to move quite far forward. And so Francis maybe later can talk about some of the development, but we're actually at the point where Cuadrilla has actually drilled a horizontal into one of the development, or one of the exploration pads they're looking at. They've completed that. They're drilling a second well now, and in the second half of this year they'll be fracking. And the infrastructure in the UK is actually very, very strong. So I don't think there's a concern about infrastructure. The quality of the rocks is, from what everybody has seen, is very, very strong, comparable to some of the best in the US. So really, it's a matter of whether the rocks will deliver. They haven't. The last box to tick is whether it actually flows in the way that we would hope. But then it's actually relatively simple from an infrastructure point of view of actually connecting two systems, which is somewhat different to perhaps elsewhere.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I guess just to add on to what Julian was saying is, really with Francis, once you have the British Geological Survey coming out, and it's not tens of millions of barrels or hundreds of millions of barrels, this is massive volumes of hydrocarbons in the ground. And really back in 2013, investors' eyes pique interest, because where else in the world do you find resource of that size and that scale? And from iGas to the juniors down, you saw sort of a microwave of development capital going in. Equity capital markets supported the juniors acquiring acreage, starting to do some of the early appraisal activity. Cuadrilla and the others started to bring farm-in partners with Ineos, with Centrica, with Total coming in, and then you had a sort of a kind of pause period as you had to work through what can be a frustrating appraisal and permitting process, and actually working that system through from acquiring the acreage to now really at the point where we're now in 2018. Cuadrilla will be the one really to lead the pack and understand how do the rocks actually work. But from 2013, you proved the capital markets and the capital investment into the sector works, because the size of the prize is significant. And after this kind of 5-year period on hold, you're now at the point where either there's materiality in what you're able to extract, the process actually works, and if so, then the next question is going to be, where does phase 2 of that capital come in? Did the equity capital markets come back and support this for round 2 in a bigger and more robust way? Do you see private capital start to fund and flow through? Do you see debt capital come to flow through? But really where Francis is getting to, it's a pretty critical and monumental moment in the UK shale period.
How do you see the sort of macro political situation at the moment with regard to Russia and the sort of growing desire to be energy independent? How do you see that sort of pushing investors to look more at UK opportunities?
It's a big push, because the main question is, where does the gas come from? Every route and option, whether you're looking through the Southern Caucasus, whether you're looking at Nord Stream, every bit of it it's multi-jurisdictional. You've got a lot of different players and intergovernmental bodies looking at it, and the main concern is, where does the gas coming from? What are relations with one of the biggest suppliers, and how do you diversify away from that? LNG helps to transform that pretty significantly, both on the actual liquid side as well as the petroleum products. And Ineos I think has really done a great example of that, where they've, in a very short period of time, have built an integrated supply chain from the United States to bring NGLs from Philadelphia into Scotland, cheaper than what they would do be importing same NGLs from either the Far East, the Middle East, or even continental Europe. But the main question is, how does that work? The LNG dynamic changes that a bit. Renewed investment in Norway and in the UK for domestic and regional resources help that. But these are short-term stopgap measures. LNG can play an important role, but at the end of the day, it's sort of a misnomer when you say resource independence or resource independence, but at some extent people and countries want to be able to have some control and say over both the pricing and the source of their product. And really, at least in the UK, unconventional is the only big domestic means that can actually swing that lever in the medium term.
I'd reinforce that. I think the UK government for many years has been in every area a proponent of free markets, and particularly in energy, where they believe that gas is a commodity that can be imported, and we shouldn't get too concerned about the fact that the North Sea is running out. I think there was a not quite a U-turn, but perhaps a sharp intake of breath 6 or 7 weeks ago, driven by two things. One, the country did run out of gas. It's not going to be reported on the newspaper, but industrial customers were asked to cut back their supply, and the spot price on the day jumped from 50 pence a therm to £2 a therm. And secondly, as has been alluded to, a very significant deterioration in relations with Russia has meant that not just the UK but the European Union is becoming more acutely conscious that over-reliance on a small number of suppliers comes with a potential cost. And LNG is a very valuable product, but LNG cargoes can and have been diverted, and you're at the literally at the mercy of the market. For a commodity that's as important to industrial and human life as energy, that's a difficult place for politicians to find themselves in.
Absolutely. I mean, this is probably a good time to talk a little bit about what you're doing with Cuadrilla. Can you give us some sort of background on the company? And
so Cuadrilla was I guess the first entrant into UK shale, and before my time, so I can't claim any and don't claim any credit for it. There were a number of startup founders who realized that shale didn't just exist in the United States. Identified a very large license area in Lancashire in what is now the Bowland Shale, and drilled 3 exploration wells there. Those early exploration wells were very successful in the sense that they verified that there was a very thick quantity of shale, unique in anything we've seen versus US. It's over 2 kilometers in thickness. 2, that the rock was very suitable for hydraulic fracturing, and we've verified that through now 4 exploration wells in that basin. And 3, that the rock would actually, when fractured, flow natural gas back to surface, and that was done at the pre-salt well in 2011 with a frac on a vertical well. I think, unfortunately, as I'm sure some people in the room are aware, that frac came with a minor seismic tremor, which, whilst not capable of causing any damage, certainly caused a lot of PR and political angst, and in effect shut the industry down for best part of 3 years. And I came in around that time, just after that event, in fact, and it's been a difficult journey for the company, and as has been said, the process for planning and permitting the next exploration sites has been order of magnitudes more involved than those initial 3 wells. But we now have approval to drill 4 horizontal wells on a site in Lancashire, and we are in the process of drilling the first 2. We've completed the first horizontal well in the Upper Bowland Shale. As I speak here today, we're drilling ahead on the second horizontal well in the other Bowland Shale section, and we will be fracturing and flow testing those wells in the second half of this year. So that will be the first test of the question that certainly everyone in the UK and probably beyond the UK, a number of people are looking at, is what will this vast resource flow at through a horizontal well. They're approximately 1 kilometre wells. They've been completed with 41 hydraulic frac stages, so it will be a very good test of this. Still the initial wells, but everything we've seen so far, we've ticked all the boxes in terms of rock quality, gas presence, gas composition, and as I say, the source rock. There are prolific gas fields just offshore, in the Morecambe Bay, producing from that source rock. So whilst nothing is certain in this life, we'd be surprised if it didn't flow at good rates. That, I think, will unlock the shale, both from an investment and a technical point of view, because behind Cuadrilla you've got a very large company, Ineos, who are sitting on very significant license areas across the north of England. You've got iGas, who themselves have got very significant interest and will be drilling some wells in the second half of the year. You've got a market that's running out of gas, and you've got a government that's very keen that we develop our own gas resource for energy security reasons. So all the ingredients are in place. We just got to make it flow.
You mentioned that the rock is, you said, 2 kilometres thick.
Yes, yeah. The Boland Shale, there's an upper and lower Boland Shale. Beneath that, there's a Hodder mudstone. In fact, we don't know it's 2. It could be more. We've not drilled to the bottom of the Hodder mudstone yet. So, yeah, it gets to a point. It's for someone who spent their life in oil and gas and used to looking at conventional, where it's all about the size of the resource and how much of it is in place before you recover. It's almost irrelevant how much is in place here. There's so much of it in place, it doesn't really matter. It's what percentage of that you can recover is the key question.
So how deep are your wells?
So we drilled the first one to about 2 kilometers down. So in fact, 2.7 kilometers down. The first horizontal is just above that level, and the second horizontal will be about 2.3 kilometers.
Fantastic. And yeah, it's very impressive stuff. And you've mentioned obviously that you're going to frack in the summer, and obviously you had that problem before with the seismic things. What technologies are being employed to sort of minimise future risk of any seismic activity?
Yeah, I mean, our site in Lancashire is I would say the most monitored oil and gas site bar none in the world right now. We are, and I don't mean that as a joke. I mean that is a fact. We are monitoring water quality, air quality, noise, traffic movements, all on a 24/7, and we report all that on our website, as does the regulators in the UK. Specifically on seismicity, we are now required in the UK, firstly, to complete a 3D seismic survey ahead of any hydraulic fracturing, so that is actually a regulatory requirement. It's good from, obviously, a geologist's point of view, like to have it for imaging, but principal purpose from regulation is to identify any significant faults, and so you stay away from those when you're injecting. And then we will have real-time seismic monitors on the site, and if we exceed a 0.5 on the Richter scale, and I'm sure many in the room will be familiar with the Richter scale, a 0.5 wouldn't move your water on the table there. Then we are required to suspend operations. We will begin fracturing on a slow basis. So before each frac stage, we'll have what's called a mini frac, where we inject a smaller volume of water into the rock, and we monitor the seismic response to make sure everything is okay, and then we proceed with the main frac stage. So it's a very controlled, monitored operation. And it needs to be, because public confidence is very important at this stage of the development.
Absolutely. You've got to get it right, haven't you? Otherwise, everything will shut down. But if you get it right, what sort of potential is going to be unlocked? Do you think the public perception can be changed and people can get behind fracking?
Well, the government surveys public opinion on this, not just on this, but on energy sources in general every quarter. And the last survey, interestingly, support for shale kicked up 2 percentage points. Typically, it sits at approximately 20% of the people are vocally in favour, 22 or 3 are vocally against, and the rest sit in the middle. For the first time, we've seen a significant move, and the principal reason for that in the public perception is security of energy supply. So whilst the great British public are not particularly, I would say, energy aware, and if you ask most of them where their energy comes from, they'll point to the light socket or something and say it comes from there. The fact that it was almost cut off, and deteriorations in relations with Russia have definitely impinged on the public consciousness in the UK.
Why don't people know that this? You mentioned that the gas supply kind of was running out and the price spiked. Why isn't that big news?
Well, I'm not going to be critical of the government here, but I think there is a public awareness that could be done. As I say, for good reason. The British public has got a lot of things to think about, and they don't think about where their energy comes from. They only think about it if it's not there, or the price goes up. So the fact that it comes from Norway or Algeria or the North Sea or Lancashire is not a big news item in the UK. But when it stops flowing, or when the price goes from 20 pence a therm to £2 a therm, or 50 pence to £2, and that flows through into your bill, then they get excited about it. But by then it's too late, and that's where the politicians have a role to play, because as we all know, energy investment is a long-term cycle. It's a 5-10 year planning cycle, and if you're at the point where you're telling industrial consumers that they have to shut off their gas supply, you're at least 5 years too late.
Mm. So in the UK, Cuadrilla, obviously, it's a very interesting story. But who else is out there? Who else can we look at?
So it's actually not. It's a bit of a disparate group, but in my view, it's not that wide. You've got really 2 companies or 3 that are really at the forefront. Francis with Cuadrilla, iGas, which Julian's an investor in. and INEOS. There's a lot of juniors and small private companies that have consolidated acreage, some recently, but more over the past 5, 6, 7 years. But in terms of the capital intensity and what it actually takes to get it done, really there's 3 companies at the front end. You have some of the utilities and some other majors who've farmed in and taken positions in acreage. But I'd say that's been selective, it's been reserved up until this point, and the industry's really watching these 3 players to see, A, how quickly can they move because they have the access to capital, they're more developed in their existing resource, and they've got a material resource base to be working and playing with. Like anything else, when you've got a movement, you've got a lot of juniors who can ride on the tail wave of that, see the value generate an upkick. And what's at least unique with the UK, it's a regulatory environment. The government owns the acreage. At some point, you've got requirements. Companies will have to relinquish acreage. That will continue to churn through in future licensing rounds, and allow the opportunity for new entrants to come in. But right now, it's really a smaller pack of juniors really watching these 3 at the front of the queue.
Yeah, maybe just to add a little bit to that, as Sam says, I mean, INEOS is the 800-pound gorilla, multi-billion-dollar company, the biggest private company in the UK, made $2 billion of profits in the last financial year, so that's enormous. It's picked up a lot of acreage, but it's acquired a lot, so it's actually when the 14th round was awarded, and that was on the back of, as Francis alluded to, the 13th round, where basically a set of geologists worked around the cause and actually applied for a license in around the Blackpool area, realized they had a big resource, and then the government came in and realized they had a big resource. They then went and licensed out a couple of hundred individual licenses, but each of them were 100 square kilometers. The Cuadrilla license is over 1,000 square kilometers, so very different in order of magnitude. And different companies picked up different licenses. As Francis had said, there are 3 main areas. There's the Bowland Shale, there's the Gainsborough, and there's the Cleveland Basin. And as you move east, it's likely that there's more liquids in the gas. The further west, it's more likely that it's drier gas. INEOS has acquired licenses, and with that, there's been farming commitments that they've actually taken. They bought out Engie and Total. They actually have commitments to fund iGas in the same way that Centrica has a commitment to fund Cuadrilla for further stages of development down the road. So there's some funding for that level. There will be a consolidation play with some of the smaller companies, and there's a sort of a trading that's going on. Once we get into next year, and hopefully we're actually producing gas, and we're actually producing gas that's going into the mains and into people's homes, I think that becomes a real game changer. Up to now, it's really a sort of almost a theoretical exercise as to whether this will flow or not. Once we actually show that it does flow and is going into people's homes, and that it's not a nuisance, that this is not an intrusive industry. I mean, there's been a lot of scaremongering that's been going on to say that this is scaremongering. You know, it's going to be very intrusive, it's damaging of water supplies, etc. When we show that that's not the case, and how large the prize is, there's a lot of capital that then needs to be raised. Companies are funded into next year, but as you move from with Cuadrilla, they have a plan for a pad development. That pad can take a number of wells once you get into development, but the reality is that license area can probably hold 50, 100 pads. So there's a large area, there's a large development that needs to happen. The actual footprint on the surface is actually very small. And again, there's a lot of scaremongering that this is going to industrialize the countryside. That's not the reality. This is actually the way that this will work, because some of these shales are so thick, you'll end up having multilaterals coming in at different levels. So again, asking on some of the technology of what's happened in the US, I think the UK can benefit exactly from what the US has learned, and as it's followed actually how to follow seams, but as it's now doing multi-levels as well. The UK, has that benefit of the last 5-10 years of development.
How does the UK shale compare with the US?
Well, we've had the benefit. Cuadrilla is AJ Lucas is a 45% owner, and the other 45% owner is a US private equity group called Riverstone, and Riverstone are invested in most, if not all, US shale plays. And through that connection, we've been fortunate. We've been able to speak and visit with pretty much every US operation. And the rocks are as good as anything in the US. In some senses, they're superior to US plays. The US, of course, has the advantage of 10 years extraordinary production and drilling success. But I think what people sometimes forget is that for 10 years before that, the US were actually unlocking that place. So that overnight success stories, as with most overnight success stories, took about 10 years to develop, and then it became overnight, so to speak. So the UK rocks are comparable and in some senses better, but we have to flow them. And I guess everyone in this room is probably in oil and gas, and we've all seen, sure bets that didn't pan out. And so I'm not certainly being complacent about it, but from everything we see so far, this looks very good.
Mm. But Julian actually touched on a point about the sort of impact on the surface level, and I've seen some, there's pictures in the newspapers of, this is what America looks like. This is going to be the British countryside. 6,000 wells needed to, halve the imports of gas that we have. What is being done to minimise that sort of surface impact?
Kerrigan's been invested through AJ Lucas and in iGas for a number of years. We started following this story 10 years ago, and was looking at the play about 10 years ago. At that stage, a lot of wells in the US were vertical wells, and each you would drill and then you'd move on. So each one you'd end up with a sort of a separate development for each well, and that was to do with sort of looking at the stratigraphy that you actually had of the rocks as to where made sense. With horizontal drilling, obviously that's then changed over time. But equally, as the shales, as you've looked at different levels or thicknesses of shales, you can come in at different levels. What was unique about the shales in the UK, and the geologists who had actually started looking at this didn't just look at the UK; they looked at quite large areas in Europe as well, and focused on what they thought was some of the best. It's just the size and the thickness here. So it means that a bit like coming in with a multi-story car park, you can actually come in at different floor levels. So
how many levels can you drill?
So we drilled a pilot hole through the upper and lower Bowland on this current site, and we've high-graded. This is not the limit, but we've high-graded 6 separate what we call benches, horizontal benches, and we'll target 2 of those with our first 2 wells here. So at least 6, and that's just in the upper and lower Bowland. That's not going into the Hodder Mudstone, which extends for a kilometre below that. So it is quite a exciting resource play.
And how much do you expect to be able to extract from a single vertical hole with these 6?
Well, we'll extract from horizontals, and until we do it, of course, what I'm about to tell you is an estimate. But we had US analogues and a US consultancy with a lot of experience in this area look at our rocks and look at comparable US plays, and they have concluded that for a 2.5 kilometre lateral, we should be able to recover 6 billion cubic feet of gas per horizontal. Yeah.
And what is your cost of production expected to be?
The key in shale, there are about 3 things that matter. 1 we can't control, which is the gas price. 2 is the gas recovery, primarily rates, but primarily recovery. And 3 is the cost of drilling and fracturing a well. Operating costs are always important, and we'll look to minimise them. But from an NPV point of view, they're the 3 key drivers. So capital costs in drilling and completion. Typical US costs are well below $10 million a well now, which frankly is phenomenal. We would expect early production wells in the UK probably to sit in the $15 to $20 million range, and then with drilling experience, which of course the US has 10 years worth. We'd expect that to fall to the $10 to $15 million range. At those levels, this resource with 6 BCF recovery and current prices of $5 to $6 per 1,000 cubic foot will be very profitable.
Fantastic. At this stage, do we have any questions for our audience? Peter, you got a microphone over there.
Hi, Peter Kwong, Alpha Group. Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. Just a couple of questions. Royalty structures. How does that compare with the US? Does the UK give you any holidays? That's the first question. Second question relates to you mentioned about the 50 or 100% more expensive than that of the U.S. In terms of the cost. If I remember correctly, you say the depth is about what, 2 kilometers down? How much is how deep is the U.S. compared? Give me more comparison between the two, in terms of like permeabilities or porosities and so forth. You know, if you can, just want to give us more, you know, comparison between the two, so that we have a, you know, a more understanding between the two. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, a US plays 1.5 kilometers to 2 kilometers, and uncommon for US. So well depth is not particularly that much more significant. If we were to target the Hodder mudstone, which is starts at probably closer to 2.5 kilometers down, then that would be deeper than certainly most producing US shales. But our Well, so the cost in the US, well, a start comparison with gas prices. So US gas prices are $3 per 1,000 cubic foot or less, and UK gas prices are $6 per 1,000 cubic foot. So the price in Asia is probably double that again, or certainly getting close to it. So the US market and the UK market and the European market are quite different things. The US didn't start at those prices. I mean, the US have been drilling shale wells now for 10 plus years, and have drilled, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of these things. We are and have been just drilling the first ever horizontal well into UK shale. There's been plenty of wells drilled horizontally in the UK, but this is the first one. So when I give you those numbers, I'm probably being deliberately somewhat conservative, bearing in mind one of my biggest shareholders is sitting on my right here. I don't want to to promise something we're not going to be able to deliver. But in Europe, the UK is uniquely positioned, and that's because of Aberdeen and the North Sea, which is a fantastic resource that actually a lot of people, even in the UK, forget about. The outside of Houston, probably the greatest concentration of technical and intellectual capability in oil and gas sits in Aberdeen, and so we haven't had a great problem in getting resources through Schlumberger and Halliburton and Weatherford and all the top service companies, which wouldn't be the same if we were sitting in Poland, which as you know had a somewhat failed experiment with shale. In terms of permeabilities and porosities, I mean, we could run through these all day, and I frankly can't remember all the numbers, but I can tell you we've compared our rocks, as I said earlier, with every US shale basin, and it's within the same, pluses and minuses, but from a TOC contact, permeability, porosity, it's in the same ballpark. It's got no H2S. It's a very dry, 95% methane, no H2S, no CO2, no nitrogen. It's a very clean gas. So the government announced a shale gas allowance, I think they call it, which effectively amounts to that. Yeah. So a reduction in tax for onshore shale development. That was announced under the last Conservative government by George Osborne. Yeah, so there is incentive to get the industry up and running in the UK, and no doubt later the government will come back, as all governments do, and take their bite once it proves to be profitable.
Yeah, I mean, the tax holiday is a 10-year period for the supplemental revenue tax, so that's been sort of ring-fenced out. I mean, there is a rates tax that effectively goes to the local council, equivalent to about 3% of the revenues. Unlike the US, the rights under the ground sit with the Crown. They don't sit with the individual landowner. So there is, unlike the US, there is a different level of incentives to actually how do you encourage development within the area, and that's clearly one of the challenges that the industry has actually had. The government has actually said that it long-term wants that a percentage of the tax revenues it ultimately receives will remain in those areas, and that's what we actually expect. The issue up to now, and it comes to an extent with, as Francis is saying, with overall costs, we're in a sort of we're in an environment which is an exploration phase, and hence everything is somewhat expensive. So, again, whilst the costs are probably double where they are in the US, And as Francis says, clearly as a shareholder, both for him and in iGas, the incentive is how do you actually bring that down? The UK will be regulated different to the US, so I don't think that you will ever get costs down to the same level as the US. What I do think, though, that actually happens is that, if you actually look at what the substitution and the gas price is, as Francis says, it's currently probably twice that in the US. So if you're looking at where are the alternative supplies of gas and where in that market is there a balancing point? If you're bringing gas from the US, you've got to liquefy it, transport it, and then regasify it. So that, that's probably a $3, $4 impost of itself. So how much does the price come down from sort of $5 or $6 per MMBTU? Well,
it's right beside it. So we don't have a map, but where we're drilling now, I don't know how familiar you are with UK geography, but not at all. So where we're drilling now is about 5 kilometers from the shoreline, and if you continue on up, how deep are we drilling? 1.7.
Yeah, I don't think it's not.
Oh, we're not offshore. We're onshore.
Not. No, it's onshore.
All onshore. All onshore.
Yeah, this whole resource of the 1,300
it's all onshore.
Trillion cubic feet is onshore. So what you've got with the offshore is that the UK is now importing, or is only producing 40% of its gas. So, the reality is it's already importing more than 50% of its gas requirements. So this is a substitution for imports. I mean, and then we haven't really talked about it with respect to a wider Europe as well. I mean, so France, Germany, Italy are all ultimately importing gas. So, and as you actually start decommissioning nuclear reactors, decommissioning old coal-fired power stations, whilst renewables and wind will take some of that, there's still going to be a large deficiency.
I've been involved in some unconventional gas. In terms of what I understand, because of the depletion rate of say 70% in a year, you sort of drill, complete, move on, and you just really keep drilling to stand still. Effectively, obviously, if you want to grow, you've got to keep drilling more and more. You think about mobilising all the trucks, all the liquids, all the propellants you've got to move in and out. Problems with trucking through villages in the UK. It's just going to be major challenges. If 6,000 wells, you've got to drill another 6,000 wells a year later, even just to stand still.
So I mean that's a good point, and in fact the conventional narrative for many of our opponents in the UK. Interestingly, we went to visit a gas storage site in Cheshire recently, which is probably a good model for how UK development will eventually progress. And you're absolutely right that the key issue with shale in the UK is nothing to do with water emissions or seismicity or all the other scare stories that you're likely to read about. It's how do you manage traffic. How we envisage it is there will be a series of private roads coming off major A roads or motorways, and we've actually, this isn't me just making this up on the spot here, we've mapped this out with civil engineering companies in the northwest of England, and that's how gas storage facilities in Cheshire have gotten developed. So the truck movements, clearly there are hundreds of truck movements required, but when you put it on a major road as a percentage of existing traffic, it's not a great issue. And if you compare that, for example, for wind farms or solar panels or nuclear stations or gas stations or in fact any other form of energy, the energy intensity per square foot of ground taken is shale beats them all hands down. If you try and put a solar farm and deliver the same amount of energy per square foot of shale gas, you're not going to be able to do it. So I think in the UK we have this wonderful idea of where we want all our energy but we don't want any trucks. Or we want housing and we don't want any houses, or we'd like to have airplanes but we don't want any airports. So something has to give at the end of the day, and will give ultimately, because when you run out of gas, then some of these other nice to haves begin to move down the priority list.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I think where again the difference is that because the shale is very thick in certain areas, you can have lots of wells off the same pad. So the biggest truck movement is actually developing the pad. So once that's been developed, and the UK is very different, that it's got water supplies nearby, it's got gas distributions very nearby. That infrastructure is already there. So tying back, the site that Cuadrilla is developing is 200 meters away from the distribution main that goes to Blackpool. water comes directly on site. So unlike a lot of other places, you don't need to put that in. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the little bit to add is it's the way I look. It's not going to. What's happening in the UK? It's not going to be Powder River Basin. It's not going to be the Jonah Field. It's not going to be sub 100-acre spacing on wells where you're drilling in nothing against those geographies. There's nothing there. Landowners own it. You're able to build large ranches, and based on your EURs, you're drilling as many wells in a tight grid as possible. There's no regulatory requirements that block you to doing that, and there's no geopolitical boundaries or topographical boundaries that happen. But with with a combination thing, with technological advances, you're able to get higher EURs on your wells, do multi-pad drilling to limit the amount of pads that you have to put on, larger horizontals, more fracs, downhole stimulation, and technological advances that kind of can balance between the things of whether it's dedicated roads to try to divert some of the traffic, so at least you kind of have that infrastructure solution in one bucket. You get technological solutions to have less wells, more advanced and higher EURs on those wells to try to ramp down what the physical footprint is to maximize what you can recover out of the subsurface. There is kind of, when you put those three circles together, there is that kind of center area of where you can be successful. It just needs to happen and demonstrate to people that this isn't just smoke in the air. This is real. It can be demonstrated, and you've got to eventually flow hydrocarbons to the surface to make that happen. But there is the technology and the means to make that happen.
We're very much almost out of time, but just Brian, do you want? Got the answer. Fantastic.
One more question.
Just spread the wealth.
William Powell from Natural Gas World. Thank you very much for your presentations and your comments. The case of INEOS in Scotland is still worrying, though, isn't it? I mean, you can say what you like about the need for gas and the resistance to imports. Nevertheless, popular will seems to be, despite all the common sense, very much opposed to shale gas. And how do you think the INEOS case might play out? And are you worried about that being a precedent for what then happens south of the border?
Well, I'd say a few things in response to that. So I wouldn't describe the INEOS case in Scotland as popular will. I'd describe it as political, I won't use the word misjudgment. I'll be kind and say judgment. I think it was, an interesting decision for a country that has pioneered North Sea oil and gas development to decide it would rather import shale gas from the United States than explore its own resources. But that's for Scotland to decide. Cuadrilla has no operations in Scotland. We have a very supportive government in the UK. And I'll go back to what I said at the start. From a market perspective, the need for gas is there. From an infrastructure perspective, the infrastructure is in place. From a demand perspective, our supply, rather, the country is running out of gas. And from an environmental perspective, which is where a lot of the NGOs, raise their objections. Would you seriously think that importing pipeline gas from Russia is going to result in fewer emissions than putting it into a pipeline in Lancashire 100 kilometers away? Have they ever been to Russia?
Yeah, I mean, even if you look at the U.S., which is the leader in unconventionals, in production and technology, you still have states like New York that put a moratorium on it, even though the resource is there. You'll always have regions that are opposed to it, whether it's political will or popular will. But hopefully you've got areas that continue to support it, enable it, and hopefully others, like anything else, something that's changed can always be undone.
Fantastic. And I guess over the next year or so, we'll, with keen interest, be looking at what happens with Cuadrilla and hopefully, educating the public and educating the politicians that, this is something that we can look at expanding in the future. That's all we've got time for on this panel, but big round of applause for our panelists. Very interesting session. Thank you very much, guys.